Hello, this is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. I use this book, Remember the Ladies by Kirsten Olston, to look for death days and birthdays for famous women. And this is for the month of July. Now, for the 1st of July, we have a woman called Amy Johnson, who was really very eager to learn to fly, even though she was only making, a small amount of money as a secretary. She took flying lessons, and her goal was to fly from London to Australia, which is pretty ambitious. And this was back in about 1929 or so. But she did do it. However, she didn't break the record. And so she decided she had to move on to another goal and see if she could break a record there. So what she actually managed to do was to fly from London to Tokyo, and she set a record at doing that. Now, of course, London and Tokyo are fairly far north in terms of latitude, and so, of course, she must have flown in the most direct route, which would have been probably over the Arctic Circle. Otherwise, she would have flown over northern Europe and the Soviet Union in order to get there. That was Amy Johnson. Oh, now on that same day, July 1st, there was born a famous French woman who took the name George Sand. She wrote under the pen name George Sand. Her birth name was Amandine Dupin. She was a French woman, and she wrote over 80 novels during her lifetime in the 19th century. She was one of the most prolific novelists of the 19th century, George Sand. For July 2nd, we have a woman from our own territory here, from northern Ohio, western Pennsylvania, named Anna Howard Shaw. This was a death date for her. She died on July 2nd in 1919. And she was determined to see that women's suffrage got passed. So she worked, she was sort of a right-hand person working with Susan B. Anthony on women's suffrage, which, as you know, came to pass in 1920, and its centenary is coming up very soon. So that was Anna Shaw. The July 3rd is Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and she was a writer who drew especially on her own personal life experiences. She wrote a very striking short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, which I remember reading when I was a girl. That was in a big book that we had at home of famous short stories and so on. And it was a really horrifying tale. It's a story about a woman who becomes crazy. And I never forgot the story, but I forgot who had written it and all that, the name and so forth. And one day in the 1970s, when I was looking to find some works to present, someone suggested to me The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And as soon as I began reading it, I thought, oh, horrors, I have read this story before. I read it long ago when I was a girl. In the story, this woman who was an active person, you know, and likes to paint and write and so forth, falls into a deep depression, as some women do after childbirth. And the so-called way of treating that in that day was to deny the woman any kind of activity, and just sort of feed her up and have her rest, and no writing, no reading, no painting, whatever. And as you can imagine, that probably was only going to make the problem worse. Certainly it did in the case of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And later she wrote this striking short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, in which a woman is shut up in an attic because of depression and just fed big meals but can't do anything. And she begins circling the room and circling the room. And the room is papered with a yellow wallpaper, and she begins thinking that she can see something or somebody on the other side of the wallpaper, you know. So finally she just goes crazy and starts circling the yellow wallpapered attic room forever, so to speak. That was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, born on July 3rd in Hartford, Connecticut in 1860. July 4th is the birth date of Edmund Dia Lewis, who was born in New York State in 1845. Now, she was the daughter of a Negro, a black man, and his wife was an American Indian, a Chippewa of the American tribe. Well, she became a very famous artist, actually a sculptor. And like I say, she was born in 1845. She did go to college. In fact, she went to college here in Ohio. She was one of the Oberlin graduates from Ohio. And she became a very popular sculptor, mostly of women, but not only of women, slaves, and also Indians. And she became quite a wealthy person because her sculptures were much appreciated by the people in the 19th century. And she could get as much as several $1,000s for a sculpture. Now, the 5th of July is the birthday of Sarah Siddons. She was the most famous English actress of her time, on the stage, of course, the greatest actress of her day. And she was, like many actors or actresses in that day, she was the children of actors. And so she was born right into the craft, you might say. But she really made a debut when she was a late teenager, was 18 or 19. And she was born in 1755. So she was on the stage by the 1770s. And you can see her in a typical portrait pose there, with a beautiful big hat like the women wore in the 18th century. she was particularly noted for playing Lady Macbeth. Now, you know, Lady Macbeth was a real villainess. She was the one who urged her husband on to doing murderous things. And so she's a Shakespeare character from the play called Macbeth, which is basically about the husband, but the woman plays such a big role because she was always egging him on to get ahead by doing in some of his competitors, so on. In the Shakespeare play, Lady Macbeth, and this is Sarah Siddons. I don't think, here she is in her own pose. She isn't looking like Lady Macbeth in this particular pose. Well, for July 6th, we have a woman. We don't have a picture of her. She was actually the first victim of air flight. And she was born in she died in 1819. How could she have been a victim of flying machines? She, of course, was not in an airplane. She was actually in a balloon. And she made a show of going up in a balloon, and one of the things that she apparently did sometimes was set off fireworks. Now, the only problem with that is that the balloons in those days, and even today, of course, were fueled by the lightest of all the elements, namely hydrogen, which is number one on the element chart because it's so lightweight and so on. But it's also exceedingly explosive. And in one of Blanchard's times when she was portraying what a great person she was and how brave and so on in this flight, she set off fireworks. And the fireworks, unfortunately, contacted the hydrogen, blew up, and that was the end of Madelyn Sophie Blanchard. She died over Paris in 1819. Our next person, Christian Davies, we don't have a picture of him, her either, was someone who was essentially raised much like a boy. She enjoyed boys' sports. She liked to ride horseback and so forth. She liked to work outside with a rake and pitchfork. And so she actually joined the service as a man. Initially, she was following her husband, who was in the British Army, and she turned out he disappeared. She looked for him, but continued in her military service as pretending to be a man, which was not discovered for quite a long time, some years in fact. And she did eventually find her husband, but he unfortunately died soon thereafter, and she was really heartbroken. She was a soldier a long time ago. In fact, it says that it was in 1693 that she joined the British services, and so she was a 17th century soldier, and She did live to a ripe old age, actually, because the 7th of July is her death date at age 72 in London, and that was in 1739. So she had quite a lengthy time, actually, serving as a man in the British Army. For July 8th, we have Käthe Kollwitz. Käthe Kollwitz was a woman of our own times. This is a pretty stark picture of her, but she was best known actually as an older person. She was born in 1867, but she lived into the 1920s and 1930s. And she was a well-known artist of her day, drawings, prints, sculpture, and so forth. And she went to an academy in Berlin, in Germany, where she was born, to be trained as an artist. She was a well-known artist by the time of the First World War, and in fact, she lost her son Peter. Her son Peter died in the First World War in 1914. So she turned really away from her artistic talents to become more of a pacifist. So she did a lot of painting and drawing after her turn to pacifism about the horrors of the families that lost children to war, which of course is not good for anyone, but especially not good for families. And she lived into the 1920s, but Hitler banned her work, as one might well imagine, from being shown in Germany in the years that he was in power. He banned her work from being shown in Germany because of her great reputation as a pacifist, Käthe Kollwitz. July 9th is the birth date of Anne Ward in 1764, and she was born Anne Ward, but she married a man named Radcliffe. So we do have a picture of Anne Radcliffe with an 18th century hat, one of those nice big 18th century hats. She was a novelist, and she invented the Gothic novel. The Gothic novel was a sort of thing that, featured things happening in graveyards and vampires and that type of thing. Horror stories, really. She invented that kind of novel. Usually there was a beautiful young heroine involved who was being mistreated by a villainous fellow and had to be rescued by a handsome young man, and that was sort of the basic plot of most of her Gothic novels. It's said that she wrote dozens of them in her day. And she was translated into other languages and was quite a popular author, not only in the 18th century, but in the 19th century as well. For July 10th, we have Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune was a noted black woman educator. She founded both a hospital and a college to help especially blacks and black women to do well in education and to be healthy. She lived long enough. She was born in 1875, and this picture shows her as an elderly lady, of course, with the Capitol building in Washington behind her. She was born in South Carolina, but she did much of her work in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. She spoke and organized people to back health and education, especially for black people. Mary McLeod Bethune says that with just $1.50, she built a college on a dump site. Guess that was the cheapest place that she could find to build the college, and the college opened its doors and educated people. But our next woman is Jean Gardner Batten, who was born in New Zealand in 1909. Now they don't know, she must have been one of those women who really kept her birthday secret. She not only didn't want to have anyone celebrating her birthday, she didn't want anyone to know about her birthday at all. And she was born in 1909. But she wanted to fly from England to New Zealand. And she grew up in a family that was interested in flying. But 1909 is quite early, really. After all, the Wright brothers were only around in 1902, so she was a pioneer, actually, of flight, and did make the trip from England to New Zealand in 1935 in record time. Only 11 days. We have this nice picture of her, which shows her with her plane in the background and with her goggles on and so on. And this must have been one of those old-fashioned planes that didn't have a top on it, basically. It might have a windshield, but the pilot had to wear goggles as well to protect their eyes as they were flying in this open plane without a cabin. Now, July 12th is the birthday of a famous Norwegian singer. Her name, Kirsten Flagstad. And this shows Flagstad in one of her roles. I'm not sure which one it was. It might have been Lady Macbeth, because Lady Macbeth was a queen. But, Lady Macbeth was one of her most famous roles. And as I've mentioned, Lady Macbeth was a big villain from the Shakespeare play on Macbeth. I actually saw Kirsten Flagstad twice. I saw her when I was a student at Stanford. I went with my friend to the, I believe it was Tristan and Isolde, which is a very long opera by Wagner, you know, one of those operas where each singer sings for about 15 minutes without stopping. And then the other singer sings for about 15 minutes without stopping. And if you don't have modern technology, if you're not following along in a book, you don't know what the heck they're saying. But I did see her in Tristan and Isolde at San Francisco. In fact, I still remember my friend and I staggering out of the opera house after about 4 hours because Wagner wrote very long plays, very long operas indeed. And then actually I saw her a number of years later when she was giving a farewell concert. She gave a farewell concert to the United States. I'm not sure exactly when that was. Can't remember that specific, but it was in the 1950s sometime when she was supposedly giving a final concert and going back to Norway. But it turned out that Kirsten Flagstad had many final concerts. People would, well, of course, she was a beautiful singer, a wonderful singer, and much in demand, and people would persuade her to come back for yet one more role, and she would play another final role and maybe even return to Norway for a while, but then she'd be back on stage, and she was famous for doing that. Wagner was her particular composer. She played in Lohengrin as well as Tristan and Isolde and other Wagnerian works. Now, for the 13th of July, we have a woman called Catalina de Arousal. It says she was born in Spain in 1592, exact date unknown, and she was locked in a convent for most of her youth. That is to say, she was being cared for by the nuns and being educated in a convent, but she decided she'd had enough when she was a teenager, and she sewed a set of men's, or rather boys' clothing, and escaped from the convent. And then she continued to put on male garb, and she became a famous sword fighter. It says she fought many duels, and on one occasion she killed 3 men in one day, one duel after another, which she survived. But everyone thought she was a man, and she was finally, brought to trial, condemned to death for murder, and she confessed that she was a woman. So they took her to a convent, had the nuns take a look and see, and sure enough, she was not only a woman, but she was a virgin. So actually, it turned out that the Pope excused her crimes, and she survived. But she was allowed to continue to wear men's clothing. That's an interesting thing. A 16th century woman who lived as a man. Now for the 14th of July, I went to mention 2 people. Now, first of all, let me say that the 14th of July is a famous date in history because it's Bastille Day. It's the day in 1789 when the French underclass people decided that they'd had enough of being condemned to the Bastille, and it was a notorious prison in Paris, and they seized the Bastille And actually, I don't know whether they tore it down that day, but it was demolished eventually because it had become so notorious as a prison by the conservative French royalty. July 14th. Well, Bastille Day was the birthday in England in 1858 of a famous woman rights champion, not only herself, Emmeline Pankhurst, carried out, years of pressing for women's suffrage, but she also pressed in violent ways. She had a saying, maybe the best way of pressing your case is to knock out a window somewhere. And she and her daughters were promoting votes for women rather violently for a number of years before it finally came to pass in England. But Emmeline Pankhurst is the British suffragist who's noted for getting women's suffrage passed in England. And of course, that was several years before it was passed in this country. It was passed in the teens of the last century in England. The 15th of July is the birthday of Frances Cabrini. Frances Cabrini, we notice the picture of her in her nun's habit, and she was an Italian American. She was born in Italy and became a nun in Italy and wanted to be a missionary. And she was guided by the Pope to actually come to the United States to work among the Catholics and to proselytize for Roman Catholicism in the United States. So it was in 1889 that she actually came to the United States, and she became an American citizen 20 years later. She's shown with a halo because Frances Cabrini became the first American woman canonized, made a saint. It says she died in 1917, was beatified in 1938. The process of sainthood takes quite a while in the Roman Catholic tradition. She was canonized, made a saint in 1946, and became the first U.S. citizen named a Roman Catholic saint, Saint Frances Cabrini. July 16th was the death date of a woman called Marguerite Harrison. She became a journalist on the Baltimore Sun. She died at age 87 in 1967. So obviously she was born in the 1880s. So she during the First World War, she volunteered to become a spy for the Americans. And of course, the Americans didn't enter the First World War until April 6th, 1917. So by the time that she had developed this desire to become a spy in Europe, she was a little too late. The war ended. But she went over to Europe anyway to gather information, not specifically as a spy in Germany anymore, but probably, she reported on what was going on in Germany following the First World War, which of course was very hard times, very bad times, because the English and French, who had been very hurt by the German during World War I, insisted on reparations. They insisted on money payments to help to pay for the damage that had been done by Germany in the First World War. So she, once she got to Germany, though, I guess it gave her the idea it would be a good idea to go around and see a lot of other places in the world, and she did that. She was a world traveler. Now, also on July 16th, we have the birthday of Ida Bell Wells, known in history as Ida Wells Barnett, who was it shows her as a young woman, and she was a big crusader against lynching. There was a very bad habit in the United States in the 19th century when she was born to forget about the rule of law and just to string people up. And especially if a black man had been accused of a crime against a white woman or whatever, they didn't think twice about the rule of law. They just took the supposed attacker out and strung him up. So she was a big crusader against lynching, and she made such a fuss about it in her own hometown, which was down in Memphis, Tennessee, that eventually she was, in a way, run out of town. Anyway, she left ahead of the arsonist who burned down her journalism place because of the outspokenness of Ida Wells Barnett against lynching. But it's interesting that it says in this book that some black men were against her too, not because she was against lynching, but because she complained about them sometimes mistreating their wives and families. And so they also had a complaint about Ida Wells Barnett, apparently. But she was one of the co-founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which was founded about 1910. Ida Wells Barnett, born July 16th, 1862. Our next picture is of Maude Adams. Maude Adams was an actress who always played sort of, mostly she was playing in plays that were for children. This shows her as Peter Pan. She was probably the most famous actress who played Peter Pan, the fellow who ran away from home and encouraged other boys to run away from home and live free and fly and things like that, things that they couldn't really do, of course. But that was the story. of Peter Pan by James Barrie, which was very popular back in the day, in the early days of the last century. And in fact, I saw Peter Pan on tour when I was a grade school student in Hawthorne, Nevada. They brought Peter Pan on tour to our gymnasium, and it wasn't Maude Adams. Unfortunately, Maude Adams had lived earlier. She was the one who really created the role, or was certainly its most famous actress for it. And she also played in another work by James Barrie, namely The Little Minister. But this shows her as Peter Pan, Maude Adams. This was a death day. She died at age 80 in 1953. So she was born in the 1870s. And she played Peter Pan as an adult, but you know, she was a kind of a small woman, and she just dressed up in boy-type clothes and led the boys in Peter's life away from home, away from you know, having to sleep in beds and having to do things and so forth. One of the, there was a fairy in Peter Pan, I remember, which was usually played by a sort of a flashlight type thing. That little fairy was in reality a flashlight with a covering over it, you know, that wove around and flew around like fairies would do. Now the 18th of July was the death date at 83 in London in 1875 of a woman who spent 30 and more years looking for her husband. Now, she and he had done a lot of traveling, and they had traveled in the Arctic, which is, you know, pretty tough territory to be traveling around in, especially back in the day when there was a lot of snow up there at the Arctic Circle. But they had traveled to the Arctic together for several times. And then in 1845, he went with another man to the Arctic, and he didn't return in time. So she spent essentially the rest of her life, practically, raising money to send people out to see if they couldn't find some trace of him. And he was Lord Franklin. Well, pardon me, yeah, well, they called him Sir John Franklin, a well-known Arctic explorer. So Lady Franklin just wouldn't give up, and eventually they did think they found some trace. I mean, they didn't find him alive, but they did find some trace and convinced her that she'd better give up. She might as well give up. He had perished in the Arctic. That was in 1857, which was after she had been looking for him without any luck for over 10 years. Well, it says that she was given a medal by the British Geographic Society for the tremendous work that she had done in sending out people to try to find her husband, Sir John Franklin. But the thing was that the Geographic Medal actually was by a males-only geographical society, but they gave her the medal even so for her good work in trying to locate her husband. Number 19, July 19th, is a famous, well, she was accused of murder. She was tried for murder, and her name was Lizzie Borden. She was born in Massachusetts in 1860, and this is a picture of her. She was tried and actually acquitted of the murders of her stepmother and her father. But in popular opinion, had definitely accused her and did not, even after she was acquitted for want of evidence, she was still remained notorious, and everyone was apparently still convinced that she had actually committed that murder of her stepmother. She was well known to have disliked the stepmother intensely, but why she would have killed her dad also, who knows. Anyway, she was acquitted, and she lived out her life. So she died in 1927, which was years and decades after she had been tried for murder and acquitted. But, and of course, they never did find anyone else who might have done the murders of her stepmother and her father. Lizzie Borden, born in 1860, died in 1927. July 20th was the birth date of an Ohio woman born in Cincinnati who became a famous silent screen actress. Her name was Theda Berra. Theda, which was sort of short for Theodosia, and Berra was a name she took. But she was a famous actress in the teens of the last century, silent films, of course. And they aren't sure exactly when she was born. She probably didn't let on what date her birth date was, but they think it was 1885. So she would have been 20 years old in 1905 and 30 years old in 1915, which was just about the time that she really came to prominence. She was considered the original vamp. And here's a picture of her in her vamp outfit that she wore in one of the silent screen movies that she made. It says that she made almost 40 films during the silent era, and she was, well, you know, a lot of stories were told about how she was really like the person that she kept playing in the films. But she was an Ohioan, a Cincinnatian, born they think in 1885. And those films were so popular that they built the Fox Studios in Hollywood, because even back in the day when there was only a nickel to go to a brief silent film, those nickels added up and added up because, well, they were a very popular one, and she was making $4,000 a week, which was an astronomical sum back in 1915. July 21st is assigned to Pope Joan. Now this is a myth, apparently. I don't know, but it's a story that has been told down the years for hundreds of years, apparently, that there was a woman born in the 9th century who became a pope. I mean, she was obviously masquerading as a male, and she must have been a priest, because she certainly couldn't have become pope without having been in the clergy. But these are mythical stories of her, and it's said that she was made a cardinal by Leo IV, Pope Leo IV, and she was elected pope when he died in 855 AD, that is to say, the 9th century of the Christian era. And she took the title John. But it's said that she was unmasked, as it were, by the fact that she was a woman and she fell in love with one of the people that was one of the men who was in her entourage. They had relations, and she was walking down a street in Rome and gave birth on this particular street, which gave her away as a woman, obviously, when this baby was found, you know, under her robes of having just been born. So this was not a story that was particularly welcomed by the Roman Catholic hierarchy, as you can well imagine. So in 1601, the whole story was declared a myth, and that was Pope Clement VIII, who said, nah, never happened. However, the story apparently has lived on to a certain extent about Pope Joan or Pope John in 855. Now, the 22nd of July is the birth. Apparently, I guess they knew that, well, no, they aren't sure about the date. So they have assigned to the 22nd of July a famous woman from 1100, long, long ago. Her name was Heloise. Eloise was a French woman, and she was a nun, but she had this great love story, falling in love with a monk named Abelard, and they had a son together. And this was a true story, but it's from the 1100s, you know, so it's a long time ago. But it's known they are famous lovers of history, Heloise and Abelard. Well, the 23rd is given to Charlotte Cushman, who started out as a opera singer, but later did a lot of other roles. And the picture we have of her shows her as Romeo with her sister playing Juliet. So that's Charlotte Cushman on the left, a famous actress. For the 24th, Amelia Earhart. And she's best known, of course, for a flight that she was never found from. She made a number of wonderful flights, but she disappeared over the Pacific in 1937, Amelia Earhart, and they've never found out what happened to her. Well, we have James Barrie, who was a young man, but really a young woman, way back in 1865. He died, or she died, as the case may be. The 26th of July, Gracie Allen. Gracie Allen was a famous radio star when I was a girl. She played with her husband, George Allen, and we used to listen every week to the Burns and Allen show. 27th of July, Diane Arbus, who actually committed suicide in 1971 on this 27th of July. She had been a well-known fashion photographer. The 28th, Judith Leister, famous painter, born in 1609, a long time ago, and this is a self-portrait. 29th, Clara Bow, the vamp woman, for sure. 30th of July, Emily Bronte, born in 1818, and author of Wuthering Heights. And finally, the 31st of July, Helena Blavatsky, who was a theosophist. She founded the Theosophical Society in 1875. So there we have our July birthdays and death days. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.